Okay, well, thank you very much, and I appreciate your presence here, and particularly a former student from Brock. It's very nice to see a familiar face in the audience. And I want to thank the York Centre for International and Security Studies and Dr. Lundstrom and Chris Hendershot in particular for the invitation and for organizing the series and this talk. And I'm just sorry that I haven't been able to attend the series, which looks really, it's been wonderful to see what's been brought together. So I'm going to, I'm just going to get into my technology here and try and keep up with what's behind me. I want to give a little bit of background. I do see myself still as a newcomer in many ways to critical border studies. This is not how I started my career, so I feel new to the field and very indebted to the many scholars who have spent much longer in this area, many of whom have been part of this series. So I just want to acknowledge my debt to many, in particular, a well-developed Canadian field of critical border studies. I'm going to give a little background to my talk today, both personal and scholarly. So, in the early 90s, when I was about to complete my PhD, my partner was hired at Brock University, which is located in St. Catharines in the Niagara region. And after we made the move, I was hired there as well. Despite the short 1-hour drive from Toronto to Niagara, it was apparent to me that we had entered a region that was much more deeply shaped by its proximity to the US border. My new neighbors and colleagues readily offered information about going over the Niagara River to the US for shopping and leisure activities. My new location also led me to reflect on my childhood visits to maternal grandparents who lived in the border town of Sarnia, Ontario, in a home that actually faced the St. Clair River, and you could see the American side on the other side, and I had always found this quite fascinating as a child. Once in Niagara, my conversations with new acquaintances were reminding me of my mother's stories about growing up in Sarnia, cross-border shopping experiences, dealing with American tourists, and some of her discussion of fugitive slaves in the past coming to a welcoming Canadian side. So I started to think about the possibility of a research project based on border life. Also of significance to the particular topic of this talk was a moment some years after my arrival in Niagara when I read a 1998 news report of a death apparently by suffocation of an infant who had been involved in a crossing at one of the Niagara border bridges. The case had involved 2 South African legal immigrants to the U.S. who were pulled over for inspection by U.S. custom agents who had noticed an empty car seat and whose further search then uncovered the 9-month-old boy and his mother. No nationality was mentioned in the report. The boy and his mother were hiding under a blanket. The child apparently appeared lethargic and was declared dead at the hospital. So this small report stayed with me, first because I was shocked to read it, but then I was shocked that I was shocked, and as a couple of days later kind of realizing that I needed to rethink my apparently uncritical absorption of a mythology of a friendly, benign Canadian US border, and I needed to rethink this local border in ways that might parallel other borders that are more commonly recognized as sites of structural violence. So my talk today is part of a larger project that was funded by SSHRC way back in 2001. It was titled Border Kids, Children's Culture, Nationalism, and Globalization. I was in a Department of Child and Youth Studies at the time. The larger project aimed to examine experiences of border life as described by young border residents on the Canadian side. And I was initially interested in exploring the extent to which local debordering processes linked to free trade and NAFTA might be associated with new forms of more hybridized and perhaps North Americanized identities of young borderlanders. This focus reflected the geopolitics and the related border studies literature of the 1990s. Oh, I'm going to catch up with myself. project funded, okay. Particularly, I'm an anthropologist, so I was particularly influenced by the anthropology of borders literature of that time, the work of people like Hastings Donan, Tom Wilson, Pablo Villa, and Daphne Verdal, amongst others. And following this work then, I was interested, just to quote Passy, in the local narratives that people associate with borders and border crossing in their everyday lives, or to quote Wilson and Donan, the cultural constructions which give meaning to the boundaries between communities and between nations. So the original project had proposed to interview young adult border residents about their childhood experiences of border life, but the plan was to follow this with focus groups with children and youth. So I began to recruit for interviews at my local university campus. By September 2001, I had conducted 6 interviews. But border studies is often running to catch up with border changes. And so having done these 6 interviews by September 2001, following the events of 9/11, the interviews that had been aimed at focusing more on stories of childhood and youth were incorporating accounts of the dramatic changes that were occurring at the local border and their impact on young adults, their friends and family as border residents. These accounts were easily emerging because the interviews were open-ended, so people were able to offer their thoughts on what was going on around them. So given these emergent realities, I made a decision to more systematically pursue what was going on in the present, to incorporate questions into the interview schedule, and to continue interviewing young adults. And I basically abandoned my original plan to go to focus groups with children. So I went on then to continue on with interviews, ended up doing 51 interviews with largely young adults, although it was a little bit of age range. These were conducted between 2001 and 2004, 51 interviews. So we're talking, a decade ago. This is a particular slice, a particular snapshot in terms of time and place, but it was a very interesting time and place to be, given the changes that were occurring. In addition to the interviews, I compiled a database of border-related press reports from a major daily, the Canadian Niagara Falls Review. These were collected from the period of online availability, which was 1999, to the end of 2005. I've continued on, but I'm just staying with that time period today. I also looked at some wider press. If there was a story in the Niagara Falls Review, I would look to see how it might have been picked up elsewhere at times. In addition, I was a border resident, and so I was able to draw on the kind of everyday conversations that I had with friends, neighbors, colleagues about their border life, border crossings, and of course I had some border crossings myself. And I took some opportunities, for instance, to volunteer at the local Friendship Festival, which celebrated Canadian-U.S. relations in Fort Erie at the time. I attended some border events like support for the war resistors that went on in Fort Erie. So some of you may not be familiar with the region, so just to give you a little sense here of the region that I'm talking about, Niagara claims to be unique amongst U.S.-Canada border regions for the size and density of its population and cross-border interactions. The area is a leading North American tourist destination, major corridor for continental trade, and a site of intense post-9/11 securitization. The boundary line follows the Niagara River, that runs 55 kilometers from Lake Ontario to Lake Erie. It's crossed by 3 railway and 4 vehicle bridges. Queenston-Lewiston Bridge links Queenston, Ontario, and Lewiston, New York. The Whirlpool and Rainbow Bridges connect Niagara Falls, Ontario to Niagara Falls, New York. And the Peace Bridge joins Fort Erie, Ontario with Buffalo, New York. Okay, so the Binational Economic and Tourism Alliance, which is one of the local groups that works toward greater cross-border trade and integration and cross-border tourism, promoting the border region, makes the case that the Niagara region is foremost in terms of numerical combined vehicle, bus, pedestrian crossings. If you combine all the bridges and all those kinds of crossings, that it's number 1 in the Canadian-U.S. border region and is second in terms of truck traffic. The latest figure is about 13 million crossings a year. Okay, so groups like the Binational Economic and Tourism Alliance, as I said, are interested in promoting the border region, particularly in terms of trade and tourism. So part of my project has been paying some attention to these more official and elite aspects of border life, borderland discourse and projects, but I'm really more focused on that kind of border from below perspective. So I'm more interested in the experiences and perspectives of more everyday Canadian border residents, who I see as essentially long-term participant observers of their local border, people for whom the border region is home rather than a trade corridor or a tourist destination. So there is a recognition, of course, from elites and officials that border residents can be quite important in terms of elite border projects, recognizing that residents are not just reactive agents, but can play a proactive role with respect to centrally driven state projects, as Donan and Wilson point out. And as a result, there is state and industry interest in some funding for border-related research that elicits local experiences and perspectives, but often with the goal of facilitating those elite or official border projects. Some of this work focuses on border regions as corridors or gateways for potentially lucrative or dangerous cross-border mobilities. Some of this work emphasizes how border regions or communities may be peripheralized from centers of power or problematically caught in the middle between competing state agendas. But I still find that some of this does focus disproportionately on local border elites in terms of the kind of people who are talked about. So I think it's quite important that there be an independent border studies, hopefully a critical border studies that goes beyond these kinds of official and elite forms of interest in border research, and that I think that space for independent border studies needs to be kept. Okay, so I've done that larger project. I've published on things like memories of childhood border crossings, the role of tourism work and anti-Americanism in Niagara, national binationalized identities, the local experience of the smartening border, and most recently on whiteness and racialized crossings. But what I'm going to focus on is just one piece today that is a version of which is forthcoming in the Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies, and this is the topic of unauthorized crossings that I said attracted my interest with that 1998 report of the child trying to cross the border. So I had that interest, but when I looked for Canadian work in this area, it was clear that there wasn't a lot, particularly with respect to land borders. So in Canada, the issue of unauthorized border crossings has come to the forefront primarily in connection with unauthorized coastal arrivals. And this phenomenon, both historically and more currently, has attracted often sensationalized attention, more so than the numerically more significant airport and land border arrivals. Unauthorized crossings at the Canada-US land border have received less political, popular, or scholarly attention. However, post 9/11, the US preoccupation with illegal migrants has been broadened from the focus on the southern border to the northern border, and now does receive heightened attention and increasingly from Canadian authorities as well, intensifying discussion of this. So my focus is, as I said, for a very limited time and place, just before and after 9/11 in Niagara, but my hope is that this will inspire much more work that focuses on this more recent politicization and demonstrate the relevance of comparative work in critical border studies for discussions of the Canada-US border. So I want to now offer just some of my ways of thinking about unauthorized crossings, and I'm sure a lot of what I'm going to say now has been covered by other talks in this series. But critical migration border scholars have emphasized the need to locate migration in general and unauthorized border crossings in particular within a political economy of neoliberal global capitalism that produces displacement, dispossession, and marginalization, particularly in the global south. And a lot of this migration While most cross-border migration occurs within the global south, the scholarship and international governance of migration is dominated by a northern perspective that tends to focus on south to north flows. So in the North American context, we have a lot of work done on the Mexican-US border, much more limited attention paid to the Canada-US border. So the neoliberal global capitalism that produces migration flows out of peripheralized areas also produces demand in wealthier regions for precisely the kind of flexible and super exploitable labor provided by unauthorized migrants, as people like Nandita Sharma have described. Many wealthier states have, however, responded to unauthorized flows with highly visible assertions of border control and restrictive migration and citizenship policies. Scholars have linked such state actions to a perceived need to perform the nation state, often in racially nationalized ways, to citizens in the context of an unsettling globalization, where, to quote Monk, controlling who enters the state and who does not is one of the few remaining powerful attributes of national sovereignty. As Sharma points out, however, the spectacle of border enforcement and other restrictions do very little to actually restrict migration. Border and immigration policies and practices, she says, do not reduce flows so much as differentiate them. So we have the more facilitated and secured transnational mobilities for some, the business, professional elites, and the more constrained mobilities of the less privileged. Differentiated and stratified global mobilities may be growing as a result of intensified securitization of migration prior to and since 9/11. And as authorized and non-authorized means of access to wealthy regions have become more restricted or policed, many suggest migratory flows are redirected to lengthier, often more dangerous, clandestine border crossings, sometimes with greater reliance on more sophisticated, more expensive smuggling services. So securitization, it's argued by some, has led to greater migrant insecuritization, not only during the migratory journey itself, but also within destination countries. Scholars have talked about increased interior surveillance, immigration enforcement, as well as the pre-clearance interdiction and offshore detention, which means that borders are everywhere. So certainly in Canada, the post-9/11 period has seen pathways to secure status becoming, to quote Goldring et al., increasingly precarious and conditional on requirements that are often difficult to meet or maintain. And as Anderson et al. Note, quote, borders follow people and surround them as they try to access paid labor, welfare benefits, health, labor protections, education, civil associations, and justice. So in Canada, the pathway to undocumented or unauthorized statuses of various types more commonly follows authorized entry. And this illuminates why so much critical Canadian pro-migrant scholarship has focused on things that affect migrants within the Canadian state. So issues of regularization, detention, mobilizing against deportation. And so clearly it's essential to have work that focuses on these kind of non-territorial bordering processes and the territorial bordering that occurs far from actual borders. But I think along with all of that important literature, there's also a kind of ongoing need to maintain some simultaneous focus on territorial border sites that Monk, citing Sutcliffe, describes as particularly acute site for the violation of human rights in the era of globalization. So I'm picking up that and I'm drawing on local sources to reveal the ways in which the Canada-US border at Niagara, while on a much reduced scale, obviously, than the Mexico-US or the European Union frontier, is nonetheless a site of structural violence. And while this may seem obvious to some of you, I think it is an important point to reiterate, given still widespread constructions of a relatively benign border, as my own shocked response to that news report, I think, indicates. So, thinking about the Canada-US land border, we can note work that points to how border making has imposed on pre-existing Indigenous territories and mobilities, how Indigenous understandings and practices may continue to challenge dominant definitions and policing of so-called unauthorized crossings or smuggling. There's also a substantial literature Now, on racialized and other differentiated Canadian bordering, Bandar, Davina Bandar has drawn attention to how the contemporary border continues to be, quote, constituted differently depending on racialized, class, and gendered bodies that pass through its mechanisms. And Pratt, Anna Pratt, who some of you I hope know, and Thompson's, their work has shown how frontline Canadian officials use, quote, racialized risk knowledges to differentiate border crossers on the basis of perceived attributes of race, nationality, ethnicity, culture, and religion. And other examples of differentiation or sorting can be seen in the fast tracking of some crossers through trusted traveler programs, FAST and Nexus, that use dedicated lanes or bridges in Niagara and elsewhere to expedite cross-border mobilities. So in addition to these kind of differentiated or sorted border crossings are the unauthorized border crossings at or between ports of entry that I'm interested in here. So by definition, it's difficult to have a kind of quantitative numerical sense of this phenomenon. I've just put up here one set of numbers that come from the period just after the period I'm talking about, from the Canada-US Integrated Border Enforcement Team Threat Assessment 2007, suggesting numbers of, you can see here primarily US bound, much less Canadian bound. These are numbers of apprehensions between, not at, ports of entry. I don't have figures for the combined at and between in both directions. There's some numbers from the agents in Buffalo for 2004, talking about 75 people caught trying to enter the U.S. illegally in that year. And they compare this to 2,000 across the whole border trying to enter the U.S., but they don't clarify whether it's at or between or both, and that's just U.S. bound. I mention these just because I'm going to be throwing out a number of numbers as I move through some of the local reporting material, and you'll see that these are far from consistent. Okay. Turning to Niagara specifically. So in Niagara, we do have our kind of regional tourism celebration of the history of the Underground Railroad that smuggled fugitive slaves to Canadian Niagara in the 19th century. And this is part of the visible element of local history. A little less visible is, but documented by local historians, is the phenomenon of the smuggling of, particularly with the U.S.-Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the smuggling of Asians from Canada to the U.S. In a period of time in the late 19th century, and a little later, the so-called undesirable European migrants from southern and central Europe also were smuggled across the Niagara River. These operations were often done by local white family smuggling businesses, some in Fort Erie, operated by prominent individuals whose ability to circumvent enforcement was often facilitated by their past or ongoing roles as government immigration, law enforcement, or railway workers. And it's clear that some local judges imposed very lenient sentences when they or their associates were caught in these particular activities. From 1920 on, U.S. prohibition resulted in a redirection of the smuggling of people, migrants, to a smuggling of alcohol. In 1924, the speedboats of the newly established U.S. Border Patrol were equipped with machine guns on the Niagara River. And the militarizing of the Niagara border contrasted with official speeches at the Peace Bridge opening in 1927 that emphasized harmonious cross-border relations. So just moving up to my project, I was interested in this phenomenon. As I mentioned, so I included some questions in my interview schedule that I hoped might illuminate the degree of local knowledge and understandings of differentiated crossings, including unauthorized crossings. So some of the questions I asked, and remember that the project was aimed in its first iteration at childhood, youth kind of experiences. So I said, as a child, were you aware that some people might have problems crossing the border, like friends, neighbors, tourists, immigrants, refugees? As a child, were you aware of the risks that some people took in border crossings, being turned back, arrested, deported, injured, or killed in the crossing process? And then I said, what factors do you think make it easy or difficult for people to cross today? So these were the kinds of questions I asked. So some of the responses to these, and then my database of press reports in particular, is the basis for what I'm going to move to now. So one of the things to mention is that it was clear from the interviews that people were aware of local Canadians and Americans who were involved in unauthorized crossings. But these were very rarely illegalized. They weren't discussed as illegal or criminal, often discussed then as elusive, for instance. So we have Niagara Falls Review reporting on the interception of a Canadian man who was attempting to enter the U.S. in a rowboat, or a local Canadian child and teenager who walked undetected across an international bridge. And these reports did not include illegalizing kind of terminology in the reporting. And an unauthorized entry to the U.S. by a local Canadian man whose criminal record precluded authorized entry was described by an interviewee as elusive rather than illegal. Along with discussion of crossings, there was a lot of discussion of everyday smuggling. So all of the interviewees talked about their own or their friends or their families' involvement in bringing goods back from cross-border shopping that were not declared. And they also talked about how this was facilitated by people who were employed at the border, who were also often family and friends. So the employment at the border is a major source of employment, and people were linked in to the border infrastructure. The local press also made it clear that there were examples of official facilitation and participation in smuggling of both people and goods, some of these small scale, some of them very large scale involvement. So, in terms of the press, there seemed to be largely kind of tolerant, sympathetic portrayals, even sympathy for local white Canadian and Americans involved in unauthorized crossings and activities. So in the reporting of a case of a man who had been deported for the 8th time after visiting a Canadian wife who could not join him in the U.S. due to her criminal conviction, you have the headline, "True Love Knows No Borders," and you have a kind of sympathetic, very humanizing account of the difficulties experienced. Other similar press stories humanized rather than illegalized unauthorized Canadian-American crossers, also focusing on how their romantic and or familial reunification goals were being thwarted by border enforcement. So you have St. Catherine's Bride fighting U.S. immigration rules. So again, you have an absence of illegalizing terminology in this kind of reporting and in the interview references. What this meant was that the category I'm going to talk about next, illegal alien, was consistently being applied to non-Canadian or non-U.S. or presumptively non-Canadian, non-U.S. nationals. And these crossings were portrayed as transit, or involving Canada and the U.S. as transit countries, particularly to Canada for U.S. bound, rather than source countries for these illegal alien crossers. And I think this just reminds us of the ways in which illegality and alienity are socially, culturally, politically constructed if we contrast those two. So I'm now turning to those who are more consistently identified as illegal aliens or illegal migrants. So in the interviews, many described their awareness that there were such people and that such people were attempting clandestine crossings both at and between ports of entry by climbing over bridges, hiding in trains and trucks, and dangerous river crossings. So one young man from Niagara Falls, Ontario, for example, recalled hearing about migrants crawling across the top of the bridge. Another male from Fort Erie had heard about would-be migrants trying to hop trains. A Niagara-on-the-Lake female resident referred to migrants hanging on to the bottoms of trucks. Another from the same town recounted how when he was 10, we had 2 people from Honduras try to cross over, and one of them died in the crossing, he recalled. This latter respondent, who was aware of such incidents because his father was an emergency worker, added that another time there was someone from Guatemala that tried to cross in, and again this was unsuccessful. Interviewees also referred to crossings in the river itself, A young woman from Thorold had heard about some man, I think he was Chinese. He was trying to come to Canada from the States, and I remember hearing about how he fell back into the river, and that really scared me. The most extensive account came from a male interviewee from St. Catharines who had worked at a funeral home and as a result had been involved with the retrieval of bodies from the Niagara River. He recalled how Chinese immigrants trying to get from Canada to the United States bought an inflatable pool and tried to paddle across the lower Niagara River, but there were hunks of ice in the lower river at that time, and the raft sank and one of them drowned. And a lot of these accounts were very racialized. One shared his perception that those involved tended to be, quote, minorities and ethnicities. So this is just some of the interview accounts. I have a lot more from the press, and I'm just really going to go through this now, talking about local press reporting. So the local press, I'm talking about the Niagara Falls Review. And sometimes, as I mentioned, when there was a story in the local press, I would sometimes see it echoed and kind of check, was it picked up elsewhere? But I didn't do that larger, more systematic look at national papers. One of the striking features of the Canadian Niagara Falls Review reporting on unauthorized crossings was the almost exclusive reliance on U.S. border enforcement for often verbatim accounts of U.S.-bound illegal aliens or illegal migrants. So for Canadian readers, the issue was portrayed as being one of primary concern to the U.S. and involved primarily U.S.-bound crossings. And this made the Canadian readers then aware of the dangers and deaths involved, but it distanced them as Canadian readers from the issue. So I mentioned that I looked at online reporting. It started in 1999. It's easiest to access. This opened then with a report on a U.S. custom agent's discovery of 4 Chinese women under a U.S.-bound truck on the Queenston-Lewiston Bridge. This story was picked up by the Globe and Mail and the New York Times. The issue of illegal migrants at Niagara reappeared in local and national reporting just over a week later, when 6 U.S.-bound individuals, also identified as Chinese, were intercepted while attempting to crawl across the Whirlpool Bridge. The local reporting on the second incident referred to a history of migrant drownings in the Niagara River. 2 weeks later, a Globe and Mail story reported the death of one of a group of 6 would-be crossers. The 25-year-old woman, described originally from Peru, had died of injuries sustained jumping off a moving railway car after being spotted by U.S. Border Patrol. She had been crossing with her brother, a Canadian citizen, and 2 Mexicans. The woman and her brother reportedly had relatives in the U.S., while one of the Mexicans was attempting a re-entry. That much detail is unusual, however, in the press reporting. This is the story there, a headline from that. The February story had quoted U.S. immigration officials describing Niagara as, quote, a smuggler's paradise, and later Globe and Mail reports suggested that the region was experiencing an unprecedented number of unauthorized crossings, as indicated by interceptions of people from, the list said, China, Colombia, El Salvador, Barbados, Mexico, Peru, and without any further country specificity, Africa. The flows at Niagara were attributed to greater border enforcement elsewhere, notably at the Mexican-U.S. border and the much closer Cornwall-Massena, New York crossing, where it was reported 13 illegal Chinese aliens had been arrested 2 months earlier, and at least, it said, 3,600 had been smuggled across in the previous 2 years. More effective enforcement at these other sites, then, it was suggesting, was redirecting irregular migrants to Niagara. By the following summer, a spokesman for Buffalo Border Patrol was quoted in the Niagara Falls Review describing Niagara as a major conduit for U.S.-bound illegal aliens. He claimed that while there had only been 12 arrests in 1999, as many as 300 people probably made the crossing, some using very simple rubber rafts. In February 2001, U.S. Border Patrol reported that 41 U.S.-bound people from 22 countries had been intercepted walking or jumping trains on the 3 Niagara railway bridges since October 2000. As indicated in one of the previous cases, at least some of these cases involved attempted re-entries by previous residents of the U.S. One attempted re-entry early in 2001 involved a male identified as originally from Zimbabwe. He had been living and working legally in the U.S., but after crossing the border to visit friends in Windsor, he was barred from re-entry because he allegedly tried to sneak a Zimbabwean friend into the U.S. With his visa revoked, this man made his way to the Niagara border region, a few hours away, climbed underneath a bus headed for the U.S. His mangled body was discovered shortly after by U.S. Customs at the Peace Bridge. The Niagara Falls Review reported a U.S. official's claim that this was one of 7 known deaths of people attempting unauthorized U.S. entries at Niagara in recent years. Fatalities were again referenced in a report on a local U.S. border enforcement campaign against human smuggling, and this included public service announcements featuring footage of, quote, raging currents in the river, the dizzying heights of the Niagara Falls bridges, and the unstoppable power of moving freight trains. This is followed by an image of a body lying in the snow covered by a blanket being loaded into an ambulance. So this was an anti-smuggling campaign. As these reports reveal, then, we have U.S. preoccupation with illegal migrants at the Canada-U.S. border before 9/11. In the aftermath of 9/11, the Niagara border was now one of many new front lines in the so-called War on Terror, a site of increased investment in Border Patrol agents, helicopter and marine surveillance, motion sensor cameras, scanning, and other technologies. And illegal migrants were targeted for greater surveillance, interception, detention, and deportation under the SMART border agreement. Increased securitization, however, did not stop unauthorized crossings. April 2002, we have a report on the apprehension of 4 U.S.-bound people identified as Chinese and Malaysian, and it was claimed by officials that after months of relative quiet, the Niagara River is again bustling with clandestine traffic as illegal aliens make a desperate drive to slip into the U.S. from Canada. A spokesperson from U.S. Buffalo Border Patrol was quoted saying that smuggling attempts were returning to a more normal level and that there might be a backlog of people who want to come across. Newly visible bilateral cooperation was indicated by the unusual quote from the RCMP. Usually we're hearing from U.S. border officials. An RCMP spokesperson who says, "We've had several incidents involving rafts and Asians on the river." A few days later, 7 U.S.-bound men identified as Costa Rican, one is a previous resident of the U.S. with children there, were intercepted on a railway bridge. December 2002, a report about a couple from the Dominican Republic who managed to swim back to the Canadian shore after their dinghy capsized led to a U.S. Border Patrol spokesperson saying that despite the cold weather, such attempted crossings were happening all the time. And as long as the crossers can get out to that water, they're going to keep doing it. So dangerous crossings continued and may have increased. The numbers are difficult to know. A U.S. advocacy report cited a Boston Globe story from August 2002 stating that U.S. authorities had found 19 bodies in the Niagara River in the 11 months following 9/11, and that most were believed to be undocumented immigrants. From January to May 2003, U.S. Border Patrol agents reported intercepting 18 illegal immigrants using rafts or other flotation devices. One of the male crossers was described as, quote, sneaking across the river on an inner tube with duct tape wings before being hauled out of the river by 2 fishermen. In 2004, 9 U.S.-bound alleged illegals, although one of the children was a U.S. citizen, were arrested after trying to cross on a raft. So unauthorized crossings were not eliminated, but increased securitization may have made them more risky. And there were unassisted, or what security agencies would call unfacilitated crossings, and that could be linked to tragedy. There's just one, 2005, involving 2 men from the Czech Republic who simply walked into the Niagara River with the intention of swimming across to the U.S. One swam back to the Canadian shore after encountering the strong river current, but the other drowned. So, as indicated, local reporting included some official claims regarding the number of unauthorized crossings in this period, but the basis for these statements is unclear, and there is not a lot of consistency. There were, however, claims on the part of border officials that the new securitization was in fact having an impact. It was reducing the smuggling of illegal aliens from, one said, over a dozen attempts involving 50 aliens being captured in 2004 to just 5 arrests, he said, for illegal human trafficking in 2005. These statements, of course, collapse the legally distinct activities of smuggling and trafficking, as well as those being smuggled and those doing the trafficking, so it's very ambiguous. But these kinds of statements were used to support the claim that securitization was working. While most of the local reporting focused on US-bound illegal crossings, by the end of 2004, the issue of Canada-bound crossings emerged in reporting on the local impact of the Safe Third Country Agreement. This agreement meant that Canadian-bound asylum seekers who transited through the U.S. were now required to make their refugee claim there in the U.S. The negative impact on refugees headed for Canada had been highlighted by national and local refugee advocates who pointed out that the U.S. was not in fact a safe country for many from Central and South America whose claims for asylum were less likely to be accepted there. A court challenge by the Canadian Council for Refugees, Canadian Council of Churches, and Amnesty International was ultimately unsuccessful, and in December 2004, the month before the implementation of this agreement, the Canadian side of the Peace Bridge in Fort Erie saw an unprecedented arrival of 1,800 asylum seekers. In a rare linking of Canada-US migration and border policy to the phenomenon of illegalized crossings in Niagara, the local press reported that local refugee supporters were predicting that the elimination of the authorized route to Canada for refugee claimants would mean more risky unauthorized crossings. And so that linkage was made explicitly. Advocates were quoted saying migrants would try to swim or scale the underside of any of the bridges across the Niagara River. And a report published 15 months after implementation suggested that, in fact, there had been an increase in, quote, extremely dangerous unauthorized crossings to Canada. Okay. So I've given you a lot of material there just to try and establish, give you a little sense of the local reporting, interview material on this phenomenon. So the interviews in local press suggest widespread local knowledge of danger and fatalities experienced in the course of clandestine crossings. This knowledge was shaped by press constructions that tended, with the important exception of the refugee advocates that I just mentioned, to portray this as primarily a U.S. issue and as involving non-Canadian and non-U.S. nationals. There was limited linkage made to wider Canadian or U.S. political economies of border enforcement or immigration policy. And there was a further distancing from the issue evident in a tendency to blame the victim, as crossers were seen as having put themselves at risk through stupidity or sometimes suicidal intent, given the allegedly self-evident dangers of such attempts. And often this was linked to the obvious dangers of the geography of the Niagara Gorge and the Niagara River. So illegals were described as risking death or taking their lives in their hands or involved in death-defying crossing attempts. There was also a blurring in local discourse between unsuccessful migrant crossings and suicides or accidents. So one female interviewee, for example, mentioned how every few months she would hear on the news that someone had tried to swim across the river, but she added it wasn't like a Mexico to U.S. thing, like they were trying to start a new life. I don't know if people were trying to commit suicide or were just being stupid. A Canadian Niagara Parks police spokesperson commenting on the discovery of 2 bodies within an hour of each other, noted that recovering bodies from the river was not an unusual occurrence, but he did not link this to border enforcement. Even apparently obvious links between border exclusion and death were sidestepped, as in a June 2000 report of a man who was traveling on a bus who was turned back at the U.S. side of the Peace Bridge for failing to produce proper documents. This individual reportedly took a cab back over the bridge toward Canada, but just before the border marker, he left the cab, climbed over the bridge railing, and dropped into the river below. Despite an ensuing boat and helicopter search, he was not located and presumed drowned. So about this incident, a Canadian Niagara Regional Police spokesperson was quoted asking rhetorically, "You've got to wonder what's going through a man's mind up there," thereby downplaying the role of border enforcement in favor of speculation about the mystery of individual psychology that would lead someone to jump off the bridge. Official discourses reproduced in the press also focused on the role of allegedly unscrupulous smugglers in putting crossers at risk. So the incident of the 4 Chinese found under the truck in 1999 quoted the spokesperson for U.S. Immigration Naturalization Service in Buffalo, claiming that this case revealed, quote, "what callous disregard smugglers have for people." And others said, "Smugglers are not altruistic human beings. They prey on human misery. All they care about is money and their human cargo." So in this apparent defense of victimized crossers was echoed by Canadian columnists who said the crossers, or the smugglers, not the crossers, are the real criminals. Repeated U.S. official references to snakeheads, moreover, linked smuggling to non-national others, despite evidence of local Canadian and U.S. involvement in smuggling. Spener, who's written on clandestine crossings at the U.S.-Mexico border, talks about how negative media portrayals of those described as smugglers or traffickers are often collapsed, reflect border enforcement perspectives. Crossers and their assistants do not speak to news outlets, and cases that receive media attention tend to be the failures involving death, an accident, or an arrest. He also says officials exaggerate links between small-scale smuggling and organized crime, drug trafficking, and terrorism, creating local fear and support for ever larger police and military budgets, and infringement of basic civil liberties. Slack and White had added that even while U.S. Border Patrol highlights the vulnerability of migrants to smugglers, this vulnerability ultimately stems from restrictive U.S. border and migration policies. So that's all about the U.S.-Mexican border. In the case of Niagara, the press attribution of the dangers faced by crossers to physical geography, to their own psychology, and or their victimization by smugglers echoed and facilitated, especially that kind of U.S. border enforcement self-portrayal of their interceptions as benevolent or chivalrous rescues. And here I'm drawing on Anna Pratt's work with the word chivalrous. So in the 1999 truck incident, for instance, the U.S. spokesperson was quoted saying the custom agent who discovered the 4 Chinese migrants might have saved the women's lives. The reporting on an interception of a man found treading water near the U.S. shore included the U.S. Border Patrol claim that it was very fortunate for him that we were there because he could very easily have drowned. So these claims were made despite indications that at least some of the rescued had engaged in their most risky behaviors, jumping off trains, entering the water, hiding on railway bridges, as last-ditch efforts to evade interception that would terminate their crossing attempts. So framing such state-initiated terminations of migratory journeys as life-saving obscures the ways in which states have increased the insecurity of migrants through restrictions on authorized safe crossings. So just days after the Safe Third Country Agreement had restricted authorized crossings for refugee claimants, there was an interception of 2 men trying to enter Canada on a railway bridge where they had spent, quote, several chilly hours high above the Niagara Gorge, and this was described as a joint Canada-U.S. rescue of those 2 men. So this kind of downplays the degree to which migrants are desirous crossers and have autonomy that is being forestalled by interception. Okay, so portraying local securitization. So portraying surveillance and interception of unauthorized migrants in a positive light was important to attempts to use border residents as unpaid border enforcers. Post 9/11, U.S. border officials praised U.S. border residents for reporting suspicious river activity and asked Canadian border residents to be more active in this regard. 2002, U.S. Border Patrol again urged Canadian border residents to provide volunteer river surveillance, suggesting that this would be for the protection of endangered child migrants. By 2003, the newly formed Canada-US Integrated Border Enforcement Team more formally asked those living on both sides of the river, described as 500 pairs of eyes, to use a 1-800 number to report any suspicious activity on the water. So these efforts linked up then with a wider project of mobilizing local support for selective securitization. And this is evident in a 2005 Niagara Falls Review editorial that responded to U.S. plans for increased fencing at the Mexico-U.S. border by reminding the U.S. neighbor that Canadians don't need or want to be fenced in. Significantly, the editorial acknowledged that, yes, Canadian Niagarans are well aware that illegal aliens have been caught crossing the shared border with New York State, but the editorial argued, these instances are tiny compared to the issue faced in the U.S. at the southern border. Canadians here were firmly positioned outside the collectivity of illegal aliens, a collectivity that was reproduced in this argument as an appropriate target of increased border enforcement at both U.S.-Mexican and Canadian-U.S. borders. Acceptance and indeed advocacy of U.S. securitization that would fence in the illegal aliens but not Canadians was consistent with elite claims that a changing U.S.-Canadian border would in fact facilitate the cross-border mobilities of locals, tourists, and commercial travelers while restricting those of risky or at-risk terrorists, illegal aliens. Now, Canadian border residents continue to experience stickiness in their cross-border movements, incursions on their mobility and privacy, and many are in fact skeptical of the efficacy of securitization, but they largely accepted the premise that the existence of threatening mobilities out there justified these inconveniences at their local border. Okay, moving up in time. In the absence of terrorists, this local securitization that creates stickiness for locals becomes more difficult to defend. And I think we see then the increased kind of official discourse around illegal migrants, human smugglers, as the alleged targets of and rationale for border enforcement, increasing and requiring the local populace to accept that kind of characterization. So, more recently, then, the numbers from 2010 report are also showing this kind of increased highlighting of human smuggling, illegal immigration as a prominent threat, a critical gap for law enforcement. Attention has been paid to an apparent shift toward Canadian-bound movement, despite an overall decline in these numbers. And these are detentions of people trying to enter between ports of entry, not at ports of entry. A focus on human smuggling in the face of, as the report acknowledges, more unfacilitated than human smuggling interdictions, and the fact, as the report also acknowledges, lots of evidence that these are from refugee-producing areas. But nonetheless, a kind of increased discourse around human smuggling, illegal immigration as the target of increased border enforcement. With this, there are ongoing claims around that this is benevolent, that the border enforcement is about protecting endangered migrants. Just to remind, as I mentioned for the earlier period, there's ongoing evidence of unauthorized, authorized movement that receives much less political attention, including involvement by border customs officials and police themselves, including in Niagara. But what we're seeing in the current context is an increased claim that what is needed is more securitization, and this is linked to more restrictive refugee and immigration policies. Last fall, we saw reporting on new forms of unauthorized movement at the Quebec-Vermont crossing, largely Roma migrants, refugee claimants. The issue of the Roma has been getting a lot of attention, being the top source now, especially from Hungary, of refugee claimants, and we also see the ways in which those movements are being slowed down and reduced through various restrictive efforts. So we have ongoing unauthorized crossings coming from refugee-producing areas, as in the case of the Roma. But coming back then to the local research in this context, I think the local research gives us evidence that a Canada-US border site, in this case Niagara, is a site of structural violence, where, to quote Monk, migrants experience bodily what the securitization of migration by the state means in practice, that is, more risk, more insecurity, and more unnecessary deaths. And I think Critical Border Studies has been very active in trying to expose the human costs of elite border projects, border controls, emphasizing that enforcement does not necessarily stop such movement, but often redirect it, often in more dangerous ways. Local research can just do the basic work of starting to document some of that, so using the press, using local interviewees. I think there's also value in just amplifying the local vis-a-vis the dominant. So Emily Gilbert, amongst others, for instance, has talked about the kind of undemocratic processes behind border projects in North America and the lack of transparency, openness. So to kind of amplify local voices of those who are living at borders, I think has value in and of itself. While doing this, of course, we need to complicate the local in a globalized world. How is the local produced? And as an anthropologist, we think about the complexities of border cultures, the ways in which there are multiple positionings vis-a-vis something like unauthorized crossings, issues of generation, class, race, indigeneity, citizenship that can shape involvement, participation in such crossings or in enforcing making it more difficult to engage in such crossings. So the local research also can listen, but also be ready to critique local common sense and silences about this kind of phenomenon. In this case, the tendency to naturalize the danger, the deaths that occur, and the processes of othering that go on around these particular crossings. And finally, I think we can take that local level and try and highlight the progressive possibilities that are there. There are examples of pro-migrant activism and advocacy in Niagara. Some of these are linked up to wider movements that call for forms of security that would provide all of the world's people with economic and political resources, ensuring the freedom not to move or to move. The realities of danger and death at the Canada-US border at Niagara, I think, underscores the importance of these kind of alternative visions of human security. Okay.